order. It's my privilege to welcome you to the Joint Committee on Human Rights. This is our 33rd meeting of this Parliament. We're a bicameral committee comprising 12 members who are drawn from diverse political traditions and drawn in equal numbers from both the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And as the name implies, it delves deeply into issues relating to human rights in the United Kingdom. It holds thematic inquiries, most recently on issues such as transnational repression and modern-day slavery and supply chains, and it also scrutinises government legislation for its complexity with human rights standards, and most recently we've looked at the Police and Crime Bill and the Borders Bill. We also scrutinise the government's compliance with international human rights treaties to which the United Kingdom is a signatory. Our reports, by the way, may be read on our website, the JCHR website. And on July 15th, we opened a new inquiry, and we'll be holding hearings on that as well in the future, into human rights of children in social care. But today, having closed our call for written evidence, we're holding our first public session on the inquiry into artificial intelligence and human rights. Members will shortly hear from distinguished experts in academia and non-governmental organisations working to ensure the responsible use of AI in both the public and private sectors. And the first panel today will examine the big picture of AI, looking at unique challenges presented by the technology and where responsibility should lie for protecting human rights. And the second panel, whom I'll introduce later, will show how AI is impacting human rights in the UK today already and explore how guardrails and accessible remedies can manage and respond to AI risks. So on our first panel, we have Michael Birtwistle, who is the Associate Director of Law and Policy at the Ada Lovelace Institute, and his role explores the legal, regulatory and other tools needed to effectively govern AI and data, particularly in the UK and the European Union. Before joining the Institute, Michael led the CDEI, the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation regulatory work stream, advising on how to build responsible innovation approaches into the development of key government publications on AI governance, as well as authoring the CDEI AI Barometer. Secondly, we have Dr Sarah Kidden, who is the Human Rights Lead for Responsible AI UK at the University of Southampton, where Dr Kidden is a research fellow working across the citizen-centric AI systems projects and Responsible AI UK at the intersection of technology, design and society. And her research focuses on how non-expert citizens understand, interact with and trust AI systems. Using participatory design methods, she explores visions for trustworthy AI systems by everyday users, and she works on cultural representation in text-to-image models, on AI narratives within creative communities, and on emerging patterns from evolving interactions with Internet of Things devices through natural language. And finally, we'll also hear from Professor Kevin Fong, OBE, MBBS, MRCP, FRCA, FFICM. Professor Fong is a medically trained doctor who represents the Artificial Human podcast on Radio 4 with Dr. Alex Krotowski. The podcast investigates the human, ethical and regulatory dimensions of artificial intelligence. Now, in addition to that, he's the Chief Medical Officer at University College London Partners, one of the public-part industry-funded health innovation networks that links NHS organisations, universities, industry and local government to translate research and technology, including AI-driven tools, into improved patient outcomes. And he's chair of Public Engagement and Innovation at the UCL Department of Science, Technology, Engineering and Public Policy, and a consultant anaesthetist at University College London Hospitals. So we have a very distinguished panel. We're very glad that you're here today. Thank you for giving us freely of your time. It's greatly appreciated. Let me kick off the questions, if I may, before we turn, first of all, to my colleague, Mr. Alex Sobel, Member of Parliament, by asking each of you, as an opening question, which falls into two parts about the UK government approach to AI. And if you can tell us whether there's anywhere in the world or any sector where AI is effectively regulated and from whom we can learn about best practice, and therefore, inter alia, how concerned should we actually be about the position currently as it stands in the United Kingdom? I'm going to leave you to decide who wants to go first, maybe in order of my introductions. So, Mr. Bertelssi, do you want to kick off?
Absolutely, and thank you so much to the committee for having us here today. ADA is an independent research body with a mission to make AI and data work for people and society, and we do a lot of primary research into the impacts of AI, so I'll be speaking to that as much as possible today. I think the first point to make is that AI is regulated in the UK, but only incidentally and not well. So when we're thinking about learning from others, we're looking at a system that has big gaps in coverage. There are very few rules that apply to the development, fine-tuning, hosting, selling or buying of AI. That only really occurs in safety domains like medicine. And we don't have regulators in many high-impact contexts that AI is being used in. So employment, recruitment, large chunks of the public sector like benefits and tax administration. Our education regulators don't really explicitly have scope around tech use in schools, for example. And we also have a system that is struggling in terms of capacity. Our regulators aren't well resourced or empowered to address AI. I can speak more on that later. So in terms of characterising the government's approach, I think it's fair to say that the government's public positioning on AI is uncritical and deregulatory at present. It has a manifesto commitment around ensuring the safe development and use of AI models at the frontier. But in the policy space, it has published an AI opportunities plan that describes significant ambitions to grow AI adoption, but little action on mitigating AI risks and no mention of human rights. The consultation on the promised AI regulation bill has been delayed into the new years, if rumours to be believed, and its scope, which has been described by the government as tomorrow's models, not today's, is expected to be so narrow that it won't provide meaningful mechanisms for managing the impacts of recent systems like ChatGPT, for example. And the government hasn't announced no plans to address the broad range of current AI risks comprehensively set out in its own international AI safety report, and all the significant gaps in regulatory capability and resourcing. And then in regulatory terms, in terms of the system as a whole, it's been asked by government, the regulators have been asked by government to explain how they're going to support the government's growth mission. In some cases, they've been given a legal duty to pay attention to that. The Regulatory Action Plan commits it to cutting the costs of regulation on business by 25%. The Competition and Markets Authority, which was one of the leading regulators investigating the impact of AI foundation models, has had its chair replaced with an ex-Amazon executive. And its investigation into the Microsoft OpenAI deal merger was subsequently dropped. The Data Use and Access Act, sorry, I know this is a bit of a shopping list, but makes it much easier to perform automated decision-making without people's consent. The AI Safety Institute has had its scope narrowed from safety to security and has had references to algorithmic bias explicitly dropped from its stated agenda. So that is a picture of a sort of a deregulatory flavour in terms of the government's attitude towards AI. In terms of places that we can learn from, safety case domains, including in the UK, have a lot to learn from in terms of places that you have to show something is safe before it can be deployed, and there are lots of safeguards like powers to remove from market, sanctions for non-compliance. And then internationally, the EU has evidently passed in the last year comprehensive legislation that has risk-based classification of AI, requirements for high-risk AI systems, transparency obligations on AI development and use, a specific regulator, and special rules for the most powerful general-purpose systems which do enjoy has all of the sort of almost all of the major AI companies as signatories. I'll stop there. I've said plenty.
Thank you very much. That's a very helpful reply. Dr. Kevin.
Just to add on to what Michael has said, because it looks like we have similar views on some of the things. So the UK's approach is also sector-based, so regulators in different sectors will regulate AI in their sectors. But if that is to happen, we don't think that they have the skills that they need to regulate AI, so there has to be a bit of upskilling and reskilling of regulators in the different sectors. In terms of where it has worked in other countries, it feels like it's difficult to say because different countries or regions take on different approaches. So the UK is more pro-innovation, and Singapore, China is more prescriptive, the EU is more risk-based. The African Union, for example, is picking what works from different regions and merging it into one thing. So it's really hard to see what works in other regions to bring it here. So the UK case will have to be unique in that way. Professor Missy Cummings was in the UK recently, and she was saying sometimes it's good to be second, so maybe we don't really have to rush. It would be nice to wait and see what happens.
Good to be second. That's a good thought to hold in our heads.
And finally, how concerning the situation is in the UK, I think we've started to see a lot of stories about, people using chatbots, people committing suicide after chatting with a chatbot and things like that. So there are stories that are really sad, and maybe, we need to think about the regulation.
Thank you. Do feel free subsequently as well if there are other points that you want to make to write to the committee, because we will then be able to include them in our final report. Professor Fong.
This is a difficult area, isn't it? Artificial intelligence is going to be a transformative technology. It is a general purpose technology which will transform this century and these economies in ways that we can't quite imagine right now. But I think there's a massive uncertainty bubble around it, and the questions we have to ask ourselves about regulation, and particularly with respect to human rights, are difficult. The UK currently, as far as I understand it, finds itself in mid-Atlantic position, somewhere between the United States and our colleagues in the European Union, and have to choose our position, I think, there. The current position, as I understand it, where we are operating off existing regulators and existing rights and a principle-based regulation, it is an interesting one because, we're looking at adhering to the principles of safety, fairness, transparency, contestability, and accountability. But in the making of our podcast program for the BBC, we've come across many examples where those rights have been breached in other jurisdictions. And so it is unclear to me that we can learn from other jurisdictions. Right. This is a great moment of exploration. And I think this is useful at this point to give an illustrative point. So at one point, one of the people we interviewed was a lawyer who was representing the case of an individual from Norway who had asked a large language model what it knew about him. And the large language model said, yes, this man lives in this town. He's known to have murdered 2 of his 3 children and tried to murder the 3rd child. And it got his location correct, it got the ages of his children roughly correct, and it identified him by name. Now, there is no confusion, there's no one named who has a similar name who's committed those crimes, there's no substance to that, what is effectively a defamatory statement, and yet he now finds himself in this position. And he's a Norwegian, so what is his recourse? Where is his safety in that? Where is his privacy? Where is the accountability? And indeed, when he protested to the large language model proprietor, they had not much of a response. He's now taken legal action, but it's unclear how that's going to resolve. So I'm uncertain that we can learn from other jurisdictions, and I think that the job of the United Kingdom in this is to explore this quite carefully and quite urgently.
Being second maybe isn't an option that's open to us. I think Lady Kennedy wants to just quickly come in before we go to Mr.
I'm going to quickly come in because we've had some informal discussions with people with a level of expertise in the field. And one of the things that is constantly said about this field and why it's so difficult to regulate is because there are so many different, if you like, layers of development. And so there's the person who might create the algorithm, then there's the next person who might then turn it into an algorithm that will be used for a specific purpose. Then there is the corporation which may buy that piece of work. And so who is ultimately responsible? And in the discussions, I was saying, well, surely it's not very different from Ford Motors in that somebody designs the engine. The people who own the company might not know a thing about engineering, but you look at who are the people who are ultimately going to be profiting from this. Who are the people who are ultimately benefiting from it? therefore you look for responsibility, because what was being claimed was that it was impossible to apportion responsibility because of the many different layers involved in the creation of this particular entity. What do you make of that?
So I can speak here really from my experience as a medical doctor, actually.
And for the most part, I think people are very enthusiastic about AI being used in medicine, helping doctors to, for example, diagnose rare diseases, where somebody comes in and has different presentations, many of them variable, and it's only by somehow the algorithm being able to bring them all together that you can find that it's something that doesn't occur very often in the population. We can all see good uses for AI in medicine, but this business about where do you take your legal action when the thing goes wrong, that's what I want to tease out here.
Yes, and so we already have algorithmic decision support from expert systems in this. We've had it since I qualified in 1998. So when I get an ECG, a machine that makes an electrical tracing of your heart to see whether you're having a heart attack, the machine already tells me what it thinks is going on. However, the responsible for interpreting that ECG lies with me. And part of the training and the length of the training in medicine is about understanding that technology, root and branch, what its limits are, what its advantages are. And so in that model, it ends up with us. Now with AI, it's different because the technologies are not interrogable in the same way. Some of these algorithms, you can't provide a sort of an explicit explanation of how it's arrived at those answers. So if you are relying upon an algorithm for decision support, but you don't know how it's arrived at its answer, I don't know. And I am uncertain of how you would apportion responsibility there. And again, it requires new framework. And the last thing I will say is the question that we ask very often of all the people that we have had as contributors in our 36 or so episodes of our look at this area is this technology the same as all previous technologies, but just different in speed and scale, or is it fundamentally different? I think increasingly this is fundamentally different in terms of the way that it operates, in terms of the way that you cannot deconstruct it so simply and so explicitly as you can other technologies.
That's very helpful, but I don't want to jump ahead too much because I know that Lord Delark has got another question on the health care issues that we might want to just return to. And if colleagues wouldn't mind, if they would pick up the points that Lady Kennedy has just made when you come to answer the next question, which is from Mr. Sobel.
Thank you. Hopefully I'll get in maybe one, maybe two before we go to vote. So we've seen a lot of already, although we're really in the foothills of proprietary LLMs and GPT-5's only just been released and started to be used, a lot of use cases which are already stretching society and creating subtle problems, from school children generating their essays to government and other institutions like banks using AI for decision making, to chatbots, to medical diagnoses, to AI creating deep fakes of individuals or misrepresenting through misinformation their stories, as you just related. So do you feel that AI is exacerbating existing problems that already exist, or do you think it's creating new ones or has the potential to create new ones? Maybe start with you, Mr. Birtwistle.
Thank you very much. Yes, the short answer is both, and I think that the answers sit on a bit of a spectrum. You've outlined some key ones. Automated decision making is scaling the risk of discrimination. We've seen the sort of Dutch childcare benefit scandal, Amazon pulling their own recruitment tool years ago. Every business now has access to off-the-shelf tools that let them scan CVs, for example, often with an LLM sitting underneath it. Facial recognition, another example of where you're sort of scaling risk of bias, risk of sort of privacy risks, misinformation as well. It kind of depends where you draw the line. I think one of the interesting case studies is the sort of artificial media generation, deep fakes and so on, which kind of, on the one hand, we've always had mis and disinformation. We've always had it in offline spaces, increasingly in digital spaces, but the capacity for anyone to create an account on Sora or VO3 and generate incredibly plausible video content, for example, of known real people is perhaps both new and exacerbated, depending on how you cut the cake. And then sort of probably and I think what's noticeable about the exacerbated ones is the scale and the accessibility of the technology. So it's not just some gatekeeper like a large company or a state that's able to sort of manifest these. It is the accessibility of the technology generally. And then on the newer side, impersonation. Do you know that you're dealing with a human? That's something new. Inferential biometrics, so invasive texts that attempt to infer sensitive human states like your emotions, your attention, your truthfulness, a set of technologies that are problematic when they don't work accurately and when they do work accurately, but they're being deployed in Network Rail and TfL, in pilots. And then sort of these questions around sort of autonomy. We often try and manage harms in society by governing human-to-human relationships, and that's something that AI changes. We license human-like roles, drivers, advisors, companions, doctors, teachers, and we incentivize qualified people to look out for the interest of that service user. And so, that is what's notable about these kind of newer sort of risks is that they break existing systems and concepts of government. You can't license an automated vehicle in the same way you can license a human driver. And then we have this sort of newer class of risks that we've never had in an automated way before. So manipulation, psychological dependence, coercive influence of some of these newer models. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. So I think you want to ask about equality as well, don't you, to Dr. Kidden?
Yes, sure. So we've had, I'm going to ask two questions here, and one maybe before we get into the vote. So we've had a number of rapid technological advancements, in my lifetime. So Janet and the birth of the internet in the 70s and 80s, World Wide Web in the 90s, Internet Thing in the noughties. And they have... Oh, no, we're on the vote. Shall we come back after the vote?
I think, if I may, I'm going to have to suspend the meeting for now. And I'm going to say that we will suspend for a maximum of 15 minutes. But if our House of Commons colleagues are back before then we can immediately resume. But I apologise. Order. convene our meeting on artificial intelligence. I'm very grateful to our panellists. Some of you who have been watching our proceedings may wonder why we disrupted them. It was because there was a vote in the House of Commons, and our colleagues have returned, including Mr. Alex Sobel, who was in the middle of asking his question when the bell started to ring.
I'll probably should start again. So, as I said, in my lifetime, we've had all these technology developments around information technology, Janet and the internet, World Wide Web, Internet of Things, and we've had the dot-com boom and bust and these other waves. So my question really is AI significantly different, or is it just another technological wave like those? And then my other question, which is a little bit more cheeky, is one of the things that's clear to this point in development, that science fiction has foreshadowed some of the things that have already happened. So would it at all be a guide to future developments in terms of technological development, the genre? Because we're seeing, for instance, I can name a few, but like Ex Machina, which is about human AI relations and people becoming emotionally attached to artificial intelligence. We're beginning to see that emerging. So I mean, maybe that second one's more for Professor Fong, but let's start with you, Sarah Kiddin.
So the question is if AI is like the other technologies, and I feel like that's a difficult question to answer because, So the way AI is, it's first of all, it's fast evolving, and secondly, it has like many approaches. There are different subfields within AI. So you have machine learning, computer vision, natural language processing, and so on and so forth. And sometimes you even have a mix of subfields within subfields. So that makes it really, really complex to even begin to say if it's like one technology or the other. I think that's what I would say about that. It's just a bit more complex than other technologies, and it sits on top of other technologies. So if you think about the life cycle of AI, which starts from ideation all the way to design, development, deployment, and so on and so forth, there are just so many things that sit in between each of those phases that makes it a bit more complex than, for example, the dot-com boom or something like that. But yeah.
Just on human AI relations, and maybe my broader point if you want to go delve in that area.
This picks up also on the last question, which is whether it creates new problems or exacerbates existing. So I think that this is different fundamentally. I think it's different in speed and scale and directness with which it deploys, but that's been true since the advent of the internet. But it's also different because of the social aspect of it, by which I mean we get a little bit distracted, I think, about the potential spectre of artificial general intelligence, I think. That's not the issue here. I think what makes this technology different is its ability to convincingly portray itself as another human actor. It doesn't matter whether or not it is actually a conscious human actor or not. It's the fact that it can portray itself in that way. And insofar as it can do that, it can convince people of things that are not always helpful. Now, one of the best examples of that, and this is a technology, a possibility that which didn't exist with previous technologies, is the chatbots in the use in talking therapy. So we interviewed people about this phenomenon of in a world where it's very hard to access mental health services, people have turned to large language models for counselling, sometimes bespoke models, sometimes just general models. And that has had unintended consequences. So there's two examples. One in the United States, the NEDA, the National Eating Disorders Association, deployed a large language model to help patients suffering with eating disorders to give advice. But the large language model, when deployed in the public, ended up giving very unhelpful advice, gave people advice about calorie restriction, gave people advice about measuring their body fat with calipers, all of which are known to be very, very harmful. And so when it comes in that situation, the harms there come from the ability of a new technology to portray itself as a human actor when it is not. And so it's not better than nothing in that sphere. So it is different. Does sci-fi give us any guidance? Well, most of those are cautionary tales, I think, but they do mostly hinge upon, again, the spectre of artificial general intelligence, and I think that's way down the line, personally. I think in the foreground is this issue of it being able to portray itself as a human actor in social space at scale, and that, I think, is where the risks are currently. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Birtwistle, you're going to comment?
Very quickly, I've spoken about what makes it different in governance terms, about the way that most regulatory systems break if you remove the accountability of a human. The other sort of property that's sort of different about AI when you're trying to govern it is the sort of the way that risks proliferate in the value chain. So the Baroness described sort of value chain of different actors in AI. It is more so than many other technologies a feature that if you have, for example, a tendency towards bias and discrimination in a model, a very large language model trained by an actor at the top of the stream, that will proliferate down into all the contexts that model is used in and built on top of. And those deploying it will not be able to audit it for those things. They will not necessarily have the technical understanding to do so. Very much agree with the comments on human-AI relationships. We're bringing out 2 reports, which we'll write to the committee with in the next couple of weeks. One is on the impacts of AI assistance, including those in companionship roles, and the second is on the legal protections available, which are very few.
It will be very helpful to have that. Thank you very much.
To conclude, maybe you could start us off, Sarah. So I'm trying to think about use cases with AI which would actually help protect human rights, promote equality. So the sort of thing I'm thinking about is, for instance, in the field of disability rights, could AI be used to overcome some of the societal barriers for disabled people?
So I would rephrase that question, and instead of asking it that way, I would ask, because AI is a tool just like you'd use any other tool. So I would ask, if you introduce AI, will it support disability rights or will it infringe on disability rights? So I would rephrase the question perhaps and ask it that way.
Couldn't it do both, though?
No.
That's what I'm trying to get to. It can only do... We're trying to get to... let's forget about that as an example. That was just my example. Are there examples where AI could be used to protect human rights, promote equality, rather than restrict them?
Yeah, same answer. I would rephrase it and ask if AI would actually infringe on human rights. Because
we're going to ask lots of questions like that.
Yeah.
We're trying to ask the other one. We are actually very much trying to ask
Is it the glass
that,
half full or the glass half empty?
No,
Can
are there
it be
any
used
examples
positive?
which can be used positively?
Yeah.
Are there any examples where it can be used positively?
So if I use the example that we used in our written response, which was using AI for age assessments, I think the Home Office said that they found that using AI for age assessments would be cheaper than any other options, which is true, probably, but then there are many things that you need to think about before you start implementing that. So one of them is if somebody has, gone through trauma, the way they age is different from if, they've grown up in a healthy environment. So if you use AI in that instance, then you don't know if the system will actually identify them correctly as underage or overage. Secondly, the way these systems work is they are trained on large amounts of data. And if you don't have the right data sets, then of course you can't get the results. So if you've trained it on, sub-Saharan African people, and somebody comes from Indian Ocean, then of course they might be misidentified or they might actually be classified correctly.
You may say no. Professor Fong, have you got any views?
And I would be remiss, my co-presenter, Dr. Alex Krotowski, would say here that the technology is neutral. It's not the technology, it's how we use it. And you might as well ask, can a machine gun be used to protect?
That's the old business, isn't it? Which is that they say that, which the gun lobbyists in America say, which is, it's not the gun that's the problem, it's human beings who use them inappropriately and use that to justify and to resist any constraints upon gun ownership. And so it's slightly worrying that if we go down the same road here, by saying it's not the technology that's the problem. It's the awful people that put it to bad use.
And I was going to rephrase actually. Can the AI be trained to protect human rights? Can AI be trained to? Is that, that's the question there.
That's a good question.
So I'm in no way attempting to defend American gun control.
Let's
I'll
move
put
away
that
from
on the
gun
record.
control.
But what I'm trying to say here is that this is the truth of all technology. It is neutral. It is how we deploy it. Yes, there exists the possibility of applying this in a way that it might one day, in some application, protect human rights. I cannot imagine it off the top of my head right now, but that possibly must exist because this is a powerful general-purpose technology.
If any of you come up with any examples and want to write to us and tell us about them afterwards, I think we'd be very pleased to hear from you. I'm very keen that we should hear from my colleague Lord Delarkier, and then after that we're going to hear from Sir Desmond Swain.
Thank you, Chair. Both my questions relate to healthcare matters, and both of them are directed at Dr. Fong. First question is, should the use of artificial intelligence in healthcare be subject to sector-specific rules and regulations? That's the first question. And if so, why? And the second question is, do consumers trust the use of artificial intelligence system in healthcare if they are even aware of the AI being used?
Dr. Fong.
So the first question, should AI in medicine have sector-specific regulation? I think absolutely so, and we have sector-specific regulation for medicine already. And that is because the long history of technology in medicine teaches us that where we don't regulate firmly, we get catastrophe at scale. And the lessons of the 1950s and early 1960s and the deployment of the drug thalidomide gave us the current regimes, began to give us the current regimes of pharmacovigilance and regulation that we have today. And it is partly why medical innovation has to move so gradually, because we know that we can't move at pace in the same way because because of the irreversible damage that we potentially can do. I think that approach, I think, should apply in the field of AI when applied to medicine, partly because you end up with irreversible decisions and actions that can cause scale harm. This technology has the potential for benefit at scale. And so, on the other side, it also has the potential for harm and injury at scale. And so, yes, there should be sector-specific regulation. How we get the maximum benefits and reduce the risks is the huge question, and especially if we want to try and move quickly, which most people want to. And then your second question, I think, was for people who are patients who... Trust. How do we engender trust, was that? Well, engendering trust is really an issue of how we educate the wider population and the through-coming generation in the use of these technologies. With all previous technologies, it's about familiarity and us being able to understand both their benefits and their risks, their limitations and their capabilities. But you don't do that without improving the population's AI literacy. And this is, for that to happen amongst our patients, it has to happen amongst the general population in the first place. So there is a job of work to be done in providing, in this new era, a better battery of education, engagement, and familiarity with these technologies. And then finally, trust here is also a product of co-creation. So if you have technologies that are dropped on us from the Silicon Valley bros from 36,000 feet, there will be no trust. These technologies have to be co-created with the people who are closest to the consequences of those technologies, the people who use it and the people who it is deployed upon, sometimes with benefit in mind. So that is what I think the trust is about. Co-creation, building the technologies around the intended target population, and a wider AI literacy that itself comes from education and engagement of the public in general.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Birtwistle, in case you want to add to that, I think the next question is going to be directed to you, so it would be very helpful then if you could put the two together. Sir Desmond Swain.
So is it better to regulate in uncertainty or to wait at risk of missing the boat?
Thank you. Yes. A classic question of AI regulation. I'll come to the previous question at the end. So we would say that our understanding of current AI risks is mature. It's been 7 years since the government set up its Office for AI, the then Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation. It's been 2 years since the Bletchley Summit, and the AI Safety, now Security Institute, was established. We've had 2 international AI safety reports. The risks I described earlier have considerable bodies of scientific research and evidence around them, so there's little reasonable doubt possible about their existence and causes. There is a frontier of less well understood and evidence risks that accompanies the frontier of technology. Extreme risks that could affect critical infrastructure, systemic risks like AI's impact on climate. Some of those are plausible and potentially high impact if they happen, and it's sensible to anticipate and prepare for those too. So as a starting point, don't accept the premise that we don't know enough about AI to regulate. A second point is about how you regulate. I think debate often centres on an unhelpful false dichotomy between kind of letting the impacts of AI run wild or bringing in some imagined heavy rule book that squashes innovation. And there are many ways to regulate and legislate to support that. So you can legislate for no regrets requirements that you know you're going to need in any case, like transparency, particularly from the largest companies. You can have framework bills like the AV Act that was passed in the last couple of years that sets up the institutions and the competencies needed to enforce rules and standards, which you can empower to write those and certify those rules and standards later. And the government can give itself or a regulator powers to remove products from UK markets that it can hold in reserve without necessarily hitting people with it pre-market. The last point I'd make on this is the sense of urgency about why now. There is a growing public trust gap between how people feel about AI and the ambition for adoption, and that there is growing evidence from public polling. So there's our own evidence, nationally representative surveys with the Alan Turing Institute, there's polling from the Tony Blair Institute, from Labour Digital, from The Guardian, that all speaks to this trust gap. The number one thing that people said in our research will increase their comfort with the use of AI, 72%, is regulation, and that's up 10 percentage points in 2 years, which is incredibly significant in polling terms. And when you ask people what they mean by that, they say someone other than the AI developers deciding whether AI is safe, powers for governments or regulators to remove unsafe products, greater transparency and control.
Thank you very much. I mean, I was just asking whether, in addition to everything that's in the written evidence about polling, whether we can be sure that we've got all that information. It would be very valuable to the committee, and perhaps you can speak to our special advisor about that, and we can ensure that it's incorporated. I'm going to bring Lady Kennedy back in now, and then we're going to move on to Mr. Afzal Khan.
Well, I kicked off with that question about the layering. That there are those who have the algorithms. Then there are those who do this, take it into different areas of interest. Then there are the people who who run the companies that make the profitability, who say, well, I didn't know about the algorithms and how they might be formulated. And so it's about who takes responsibility for building in safeguards. And I mean, really, it draws on what the answer to Sir Desmond's question, which is that you don't want to be stymieing development of things that could be very useful for society. And yet at the same time, as all the polling suggests, it's felt that at every level there should be built in some sort of ethical requirements about what the human rights implications might be, what the damage might be to society, what the downside could be in uses. Now, the human ingenuity means that things will not all things will be foreseen, but at least one has people struggling with those things as these particular technologies are being developed. Is that possible?
As we're trying to do here today as well.
Yeah,
so,
but I mean, is it possible to do it into all those layers, all those stages of the development of AI? That everyone is educated to be alert to it and to know that there will be obligations which may have implications for them professionally in the long run if they I mean, it's like the business of reflecting on Oppenheimer and the invention of the atomic bomb. I mean, it's almost as if that film was made not to look back in time, but to look at now. Are we dealing with the ethics of what could happen?
Dr. Kidden, I think first, and then Professor Fong.
It was, yes, Dr. Kidden.
So, I was going to say that it is possible to actually assign responsibility at different phases of the life cycle. So, for example, if you are in charge of procurement, then you require the developer to do certain things, and if they don't do that, then you don't buy the tool from them. So if you require them to do certain things, you could even tell them, we want to future-proof the system in a way that if, we need to use it in a different way, you are able to build that into the system. So it's possible to do that, but you have to require that the person at that level does what they're supposed to do. So for example, at the design and development phase, they have to ensure that, they've done enough co-design, they've worked with participants, they've gathered the right requirements, and so on and so forth. The people who are doing the training of the data also need to be able to train on as diverse data as possible. If it's about demographics, you capture the diverse demographics in the country or whatever it is. So at each phase, it's possible to actually assign responsibility to the person who is in charge. And if failure happens, then has it happened at the training level? Has it happened at the design level? Has it happened at, retraining or refining? Yeah, it's possible to do that, but it's not happening right now. Yeah.
And Professor?
And just to come to your point about lessons from history. So, we've seen, the question is, have we seen this movie before? There have been multiple...
Have we seen this movie before?
Have we seen this movie before? There have been multiple general purpose technologies across recent history. Nuclear energy, internal combustion engine, the advent of electricity. All of them require regulation. We are in this room surrounded by electricity that adheres to certain regulatory principles. Otherwise, we're all going to get electrocuted. And so you need the regulation. Now, the question to ask here, and I don't know the answer, is this technology sufficiently different that you need to regulate it in a prospective way? Because it is different. It is different. It is fundamentally different. And the speed of onset, the directness with which it reaches the people who will be impacted by it is different from all other previous technologies. And so the question is, do the mechanisms of regulation that we have had, are they sufficiently agile, are they sufficiently fast to keep up with this? Because our previous approach has been deploy the technology, and then the downsides become obvious over a period of time, and then post hoc regulation comes in.
Isn't this why human rights are so important in these arenas? Because the questions that we're thinking about are, is this detrimental to the human condition? Is this going to damage and create some sort of degrading of humanity? Is this going to, in some way, affect the way in which people behave towards each other in a way that is detrimental to respect for them as human beings? I mean, those are the kinds of things, and it's why discussions and the language of human rights provides us with tools, I would suggest. Do we agree with that or not?
Wholeheartedly, thank you.
Wholeheartedly.
Yeah. And you're agreed as well?
Yes, agree. You can build those mechanisms in, but you need to incentivise them. We already do this in a lot of other sectors. We've described some of them. Planes is another good one. You need obligations on those further up the value chain. MHRA is a good example of a safety case regulator that is able to look at its value chain. Most other regulators cannot. You probably need to tweak the liability rules to ensure that they incentivise the management of risk post-market as they're supposed to. We're bringing a report out that in November. Procurement rules, another great mechanism for incentivising that. And you need to resource regulators to be responsive, and the EHRC has stated that its funding means that it is limited in its ability to respond to AI issues.
Thank you, that's really helpful. Now Mr Afzal Khan, Member of Parliament, is going to come in, and after that we'll be hearing from my colleague Lord Sewell.
Let me start with you, Professor Kevin Fong. First of all, the general question, then I'll have a specific question as well. And are the public concerned about unregulated AI in society?
So they do appear to be so, and Michael will be able to speak to this because there was a relatively recent study done by the Oxford Institute for the Internet that surveyed the population, 3,700 or so people, a representative slice of that population. So what was really interesting about that, and again, Michael and Sarah can speak to it more, but is that it also asked people to identify their political beliefs, whether they self-identified as being left or right of the spectrum. And both sides of the spectrum overwhelmingly agreed that they wanted to see more regulation. Michael's already given the statistics. 72% of all the respondents agreed, both sides, whichever side of the political spectrum they identified to be from, agreed that they wanted to see more regulation. So this comes back to the trust issue and the general sense of unease that the public seem to feel about this technology at this time, and are looking for some sort of reassurance. And at the moment, in the absence of anything else, they appear to be looking towards improved regulation or improved regulatory frameworks.
Before Dr. Sarah and Michael come in, let me give the supplementary questions as well, and then you can deal with it how you feel appropriate. And the supplementary are, do people feel able to enforce their rights in relation to AI? And how can the power imbalance between individuals and big tech be addressed to ensure rights are respected?
Mr. Birtwistle, do you want to go in, and then we'll come back to Dr. Kidd?
Yeah, absolutely. I won't repeat myself on those statistics, but if you look up attitudes to AI, and we'll make sure it's shared with the committee, there's a wealth of data on public attitudes to AI. The numbers on things like regulation are very significant. We're talking 88% plus on questions like whether they want regulators to have powers to stop harm rather than private companies. That is an extraordinary majority in polling terms. We're releasing some polling in next month, which sort of tries to dive a bit more under this question. Sorry, to go back to this question on what makes people feel more comfortable. The next answer after regulation is people want information about decisions made about them by AI. So that's very, very high in public consciousness about what they want to prioritise. In this research we're bringing out next month, very curiously, the public want we asked trade-off questions. So the public want AI to prioritise fairness, safety and positive social impacts over and beyond economic benefits, speed of innovation, international competition even, which is always interesting to actually test when they what they think when they're trading off. There is a strong sense of public disenfranchisement around AI. Many people don't feel like they have a say in what the government does, and it's coupled with high levels of concern about whether the government will prioritise relationships with big tech, for example. As for the second question on redress, as I say, there's a sense of disenfranchisement if you're talking about public attitudes research. If you're talking about legal analysis, we published a legal commission from the AWO legal agency about a year and a half ago that found that the mechanisms for actually exercising your sort of data rights and your human rights based on that just in most cases will not function for most people. So it's very difficult to get redress in practice. It's very expensive and you're unlikely to sort of succeed. And the government in the Data Use and Access Act has now broadened the set of conditions under which automated decisions can be made about people. So that is likely to be a magnifying problem as more and more deployers of technology sort of roll out automated decision making.
Thank you, Dr. Kidd.
So to answer that question, maybe I can use a project that we've done at Southampton. We used a method called story completion to see what people think about the future of AI agents in this case. So the prompt was, the year is 2035, you wake up one morning and your agent has done something extraordinary. So we're interested in hearing, positive stories as well as something awful, which was negative stories. And people are concerned about the things that they're concerned about now, so things around data protection and responsibility. And some of them even said, researchers are always running these co-creation activities, but at the end of the day, if you look at deployment, it happens with big tech. So what's the point anyway of participating in co-creation? So they feel that they don't really have the power to shape design decisions, even if we have co-creation exercises, because at the end of the day, big tech is making a lot of the decisions. But I think that government actually also has the power to require certain things from big tech, and I want to use the example of the USB-C in the EU. So if you remember, 2 years ago, the EU said you have to start selling phones with USB-C, and Apple had always used lightning cables, and people were like, Apple's like, no, we're not going to do that. But then they were like, if you want to sell in the EU, you have to do that. And the next time the phones were released, they actually had USB-C. So you can't actually require them to do certain things. And I think big tech, if the regulation says they have to do it, and sometimes there are fines involved, they might also listen to.
That's a very helpful reply. Thank you. Professor Fong, do you want to just come back on Mr. Khan's questions?
Yes, and principally to talk about the sort of how easily individuals find themselves able to hold these people and these businesses to account. These are some of the largest businesses, not just in the world, that have existed in the history of the world. And at least in the interviews and contributions that we have had, people are sceptical of their ability to take these people on, and that's borne out by experience. The Norwegian that I mentioned earlier in this evidence piece found it very hard to get redress for what had happened to him, and we've spoken to others. So we spoke to a woman called Jess Smith, who's a Paralympian, who was born without one of her lower arms. Who found that AI was unable to make enhanced pictures of her without reinserting an arm, because it couldn't conceive of an individual with only one arm at that time. And when she contacted the AI company that was responsible for that software, they had very little to offer her in return. And so that there shows you a problem of bias in the data sets that are used to train these tools, a end user suffering as a result, but having very little redress and very little opportunity. And when you're a company of the size of some of these companies, you can just shrug at these individuals. So that is, again, another question about how does one give governments and regulatory authorities, if that's the way you go, the teeth to engage, to give people redress.
Well, I know that my colleague, Lord Sewell, is going to ask you another question about regulation, so let's go to you now.
Yes, how can AI regulation fulfill the goals of balancing its benefits with risks? I think that's one. And then this whole notion of public trust and future risks, how do you balance those? Sarah, could you help us with that one?
Yeah, so balancing, benefit, risk, safety, and trust through regulation is actually complex. So on this panel, we've talked about how AI is an emerging technology. It evolves really fast, and there are many complexities. So if we use 3 use cases of AI. You can use AI in chatbots, in self-driving cars, and maybe for age assessments. These are 3 different use cases of AI, but they all require different things. So if you're going to regulate, you cannot regulate AI that's used in chatbots the same way that you do in self-driving cars, because some of them are more safety critical than others. Some we've talked about, catastrophic and so on and so forth. The risk level is also different for all of them. And maybe this feels that it's a roundabout response, but the impact of harm is different across. So there's no standard way to do it. Depending on the use case.
I mean, it's interesting, the self-driving car, because it probably is I suggest it probably a question of time that we will be just there with it and we will think nothing of it. So is that just the factor that we're just not used to it yet? It's as simple as that. It's an instinctive thing that human risk is about sort of fear, balancing, benefit, and in the end, and publicity, and maybe that will be enough.
I would not say that it's really about fear. I don't know if you've read examples about self-driving cars. There are examples where a self-driving car sees a shadow and it assumes that's a human being. So, like there's not enough training in that case for you to know what the self-driving car will do. And, it's just a difficult question. The second thing actually I wanted to say is that in order to measure like safety, you need metrics and you need evaluation metrics. But up until now, even in the technical community, people don't know what a good metric for safety is. And it's not just safety, it's what do metrics for trust look like, for responsibility, for accountability, and so on and so forth. So there are many things that are involved in that process. And maybe the final thing is, if I could share an example of a project we've done at Southampton with colleagues from Nottingham and King's. We wanted to develop metrics for cultural sensitivity of text-to-image models, and we thought, we'll go engage with cultural experts and come up with this list of evaluation metrics for what good an output of a text-to-image model looks like. And very quickly we learned that, the experts emphasized that you cannot measure cultural sensitivity the way you do it technically, because in technical terms it's either probability, it's percentage, it's rankings, but when you're talking about culture it's more subjective and qualitative. So there's no communication happening between the social and the technical in that sense.
Michael, maybe I'll ask you, what you said is interesting, and I think it kicks in another question about pharmaceutical industry. I mean, if you look at any drug you take, right, or if you dare go online and look at the risk elements of a drug, you just wouldn't take it. You have to put it close. And we're taking, or some of us are taking pills that, if we were to dwell on them, it would be, there is fear with information. Isn't there a sense that some of the regulation, some of the sense of this balance between the benefit, we probably just need to just go out there and just take some of the risks, and it will all be well on the night?
I think the value of, for example, health labelling on medicines comes from a long history and experience of risk management in the medicines and medical devices sector. The safety regimes that underpin the reason that people feel a sense of trust in planes, in medicines, in food, come from safety regimes that try to create a sense of justified trust in those technologies, in those systems. That is often their objective. So you have both the trustworthiness element, so you know about those risks, you've tried to manage those risks, you've got a professional that is able to prescribe you despite that risk because it's in your best interests, all things considered. And it balances that with, balances that risk for you. You can't do that if you don't know about those risks and you don't have the mechanisms to incentivize people to care about them. And I think the thing that is really in everyone's interests here in terms of keeping up is having responsive, empowered, well-resourced institutions that are able to not just give the red light to risky stuff, but the green light to stuff that is in a grey area. So if you look at, for example, what small businesses are currently telling the EU Commission around the simplification agenda in Brussels, which is all about the simplification of the digital rule book, they are basically saying what we need is someone to be able to talk to go faster and go like, actually this is okay, this isn't okay. It's when you have that lack of clarity that and you have overburdened regulators that people feel that doubt. And a really good example in the UK around AI is facial recognition. We had a court case in 2020, the Bridges judgment, that basically said facial recognition was unlawful in these circumstances, and these are boxes you have to check to make it lawful. And it explicitly considered equality and human rights law. And 5 years later, we are about to have the government consulting on introducing regulation for that technology because police forces have been complaining that the law is so unclear and stops them from beneficial use of that technology. So
I mean, the Met recently at the Carnival said that the technology was great and stopped a lot of harm.
And that is what they will say in public. And the Met is also at the forefront of wanting to use this. If you speak to, many of the other 43 police and crime commissioners or forces, many of them are much more nervous, certainly in private, about deploying technologies, and they feel like they are being asked to make judgments with considerable human rights implications that should be taken at kind of national policy level, and a lot of the incentive for the Home Office is based in that.
Well, you've certainly given us a very interesting overview, and it's very helpful to have the all right on the night response to the question that Lord Sewell has put to you. In preparing for today's meeting, I took the trouble to go back to what Geoffrey Hinton had said and what Stephen Hawking had said, and they talked not about things being all right on the night, but potential extinction of mankind as a result of AI running ahead of itself in the way that they forecast. Now, I don't want you to comment too much on that, but I do want you to help the committee, because we're now on the final examination question, which is, if you were in our shoes, what would you be recommending to the government so that it isn't just all right on the night and that we guard as best we can against the worst possible outcomes? Let's go this way around the panel. We'll start with you, Dr. Fong.
Yeah.
So this, fundamentally, we need to ask ourselves, do we need a different approach to this because of the uniqueness of this new technology? I think we do. I think it's fast. I think it has a direct impact on populations at scale and very quickly. I think it has unique properties that we haven't yet seen before in any other technology, and those principally revolve around its ability to play the role of a convincing human actor, even if it has no human component to it. That said, we've talked mostly about the downsides of the technology here, but it clearly is going to have potential huge advantages to, the way it may boost economies and fuel productivity and growth in GDP. So how do we strike the balance? Well, if we're suggesting if we're suggesting that somehow we would partly abandon the precautionary principle because of the great benefits that we might reap, if that is what is being suggested, then all you're left with is a containment policy. You must have a mechanism for containment because things will go wrong and they will go wrong at scale. And then you have to ask yourself, what is that containment mechanism? And so my suggestion would be that this idea that has been proposed of the sandboxes, of creating a special environment in which governments and administrations can learn about this technology and the businesses that are deploying them at the same time that those businesses can understand in a safer environment how to interact with governments and how to deploy these technologies, is probably the best way to have a containment mechanism. So I quite like this idea of sandboxes because it gives an opportunity. No one knows what's going to happen in the future. And so the ability to experiment in some way in what is essentially a safe space and then provide some agility to the whole thing, I think is the right way forward. Now, that only gives you a new problem, which is how do you construct that safe space? But I think that's probably the best solution of the moment.
Are you giving thought to that? How do you construct that safe space, sandboxes?
Not me personally, but I in reading across what is the best balance of trying to get the economic advantages as well as mitigating some of the risks, it's this concept of a sandbox in which experimenting can take place under close surveillance that I think is probably the best compromise that you can get at the moment. I have no suggestions on precisely what the form of that box should be at this time.
Well, thank you. Dr. Kidden.
So I think the question should be, why do we want to use AI in this case? What are the benefits? What are the risks? Look at the AI life cycle. Who is involved at each of the phases of the life cycle? Where does responsibility lie? How do we know when things go wrong? What does success look like? Just questions around that. Also, another recommendation would be a more stronger link between technologists and policymakers, because if you look at the life cycle, it feels like regulation is happening towards the end, which is deployment and maintenance. Maybe this conversation needs to be happening way before, so at ideation and design phase, and maybe more investments in public engagement and training people to understand how AI systems work.
Thank you, Mr. Burtis.
Thank you. 2 recommendations, if we have to stick to 2. The major gap in our regulatory system is managing risk upstream with those building the tech. So we need to have a system that incentivizes those best able to manage incentivize those that are best able to manage the risk to actually do so. And that looks like some of the measures I've already described, but pre-market requirements, standards, powers to remove from market, and so on. And the second, and I'm going to sound like a broken record, but is resourcing and empowering the existing regulatory ecosystem. There's been considerable work both inside government, inside regulators, and outside government with the Alan Turing Institute on what regulators need in terms of scope changes, upgrades to their powers, and the actual resourcing to address the impacts of AI.
Well, I'd like to thank all 3 of you. You've given us terrific evidence this afternoon.
Really terrific.
And
Very
never
good.
mind artificial intelligence, it's certainly stretched our intelligence, certainly.
Very good. Really great.
It really has been helpful, and I know that the committee would be grateful to you if there are further thoughts that you have that you think might be of use to us as we proceed with our inquiry, but when we also get to the point of where we are writing our own recommendations to the government. But I'd like to thank you, all 3 of you, for being here. And with that, I conclude this part of our proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Order, order. Welcome back to the proceedings of the Joint Committee on Human Rights. We're looking in detail at the present time into AI and its impact on human rights. And we've got a second panel who are with us today. I'm going to introduce them before we turn to the questions. We've got Silke Carlo, who's the director of Big Brother Watch and no stranger to the Joint Committee on Human Rights. Silke works to further human rights and equality, particularly in the fields of state surveillance, policing, tech, big data, internet regulations, and AI. She and Big Brother Watch do this by using parliamentary lobbying, strategic litigation, investigations, and public campaigns to successfully change policies and law. And she's spearheaded several national campaigns, including one against live facial recognition surveillance, on which her work was featured in the Sundance-nominated Netflix documentary Coded Bias. She's regularly invited to give expert evidence on civil liberties matters to the UK Parliament, and has also given oral evidence on technology and human rights issues to the European Parliament and the Bundestag. Welcome. We have Javier Ruiz-Diaz, who is the Amnesty International's UK Technology and Human Rights Lead. Javier is a UK-based advocate working on human rights and digital policy. Prior to his role with Amnesty UK, he worked for a number of civil society and consumer organisations, both in the UK and internationally. He's an associate at the Sussex Centre for Law and Technology and the Centre for Inclusive Trade Policy, where he focuses on the rights impacts of digital trade. He's also a member of the Intellectual Property Policy Insight Forum at the Department for International Trade. Javier is the former policy director of the Open Rights Group. You're very welcome too. And then we're going to hear from Temitope, I hope I've pronounced that correctly, Temitope Lazarde Anderson, who's the executive director of Glitch. Temitope is a Nigerian British-Canadian writer and researcher. Glitch is a charity that works to ensure that tech doesn't facilitate discrimination towards black women, and is a PhD candidate researching digital intimacy, and she's doing that work at King's College in London. Temitope is currently a 2025 affiliate at Disco Network's Black Communications and Technology Lab. The acronym stands for Digital Inquiry, Speculation, Collaboration and Optimism, and was a fellow at the Centre of Advanced Internet Studies in 2024. Temitope's work has been published in academic journals and independent media. You're very welcome too. And our final panellist will be Alex Perlot de Corbillon, the Director of Strategy at Privacy International. Alex is the convener of Privacy International Strategy Team and oversees their network of partners across the world, overseeing global advocacy and public engagement. In addition, she works on an array of issues at the intersection of human rights and technology. You two are very welcome, and we look forward to hearing from you individually. Once again, though, let me kick off, if I may, our proceedings by asking my colleagues, they'll come in on individual questions later on, but to ask you specifically in an opening question on the management of risks, data, privacy, bias and discrimination. And I know that some of you were able to sit through the earlier session and heard some of our discussions around some of those subjects, but can you give us any examples, specific examples of AI breaching people's human rights in the UK today? Who would like to kick off? Why don't we go down the panel? So,
thank you.
Please.
Thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to share some of the work that we've been doing in this domain, both in the UK but also worldwide. By way of introduction to this first question, I wanted to offer 3 precedent-setting examples showing how the use of AI is triggering some concerns for human rights, particularly in the UK. The first one is because of the practice of industry and government too, in the mad dash to hoover loads of data into AI systems, including models, before we even noticed, and without restricting their conduct. As a result, it's actually really hard at the moment to know how much of our personal data is being processed by both companies and governments. And when we have been able to hold them to account, such as in our latest case against FRT firm Clearview AI, who was scraping people's photos from social media into their system and selling their services to police across the world, we were able to get an order that they must delete that data, including of people here in the UK. The second example that I wanted to share is that we're aware that many UK government departments are very keen to deploy algorithmic decision making. For example, in 2019, at Privacy International, we uncovered how the DWP, the Department of Workers and Pensions, used an algorithm to identify and investigate individuals as part of its fraud investigations. There have been other examples raised by other civil society organizations around the vetting of universal credit claims on the basis of the use of algorithms as well. And as you might be familiar, there are also plans currently underway to use algorithms to scan millions of bank accounts of people as well. The other example within this that I wanted to share is we've documented how the Home Office has seemingly been using algorithms for immigration purposes, including deciding whether somebody should be detained, somebody should be deported, as well as whether they should be tagged 24/7 with GPS tagging. And this is an issue we've recently brought to the attention of the Information Commissioner's Office. The third point that I wanted to mention is that, unfortunately, we have very little clarity of how governments, agencies are using AI tools, and particularly agencies that hold vast amounts of data and use third-party services. By way of example here, referring that since August 2025, it was disclosed that the Israeli Ministry of Defense has vast amounts of data about Palestinians, including communications data stored on big tech cloud services, and those agencies were using AI on this data. We know that the UK intelligence agencies are using the same big tech providers, but what we don't know and we don't have clarity about is how that data is being processed. I'd like to close off by emphasizing the importance of considering the breadth of human rights being affected by the use of AI, while at the onset what we're talking about is around data and how it's being exploited and triggering concerns for the right to privacy. When the UK government is considering plans, for example, around the use of AI in health, this was recently mentioned by the Health Secretary. We're also talking about the right to health. When we're talking about FRT in public spaces, we're talking about the right to freedom of assembly.
Thank you very much. I've got to call the meeting to order because the vote has just been called in the House of Lords. And I don't know from my colleagues whether they intend to vote or not. So can I just suspend the meeting for a moment while I find out whether we need to take a break while they Order, welcome back to the interrupted meeting of the Joint Committee on Human Rights, interrupted on this occasion by a vote in the House of Lords. That's been completed. My colleagues are back in their places. We'd heard from the first of our witnesses. I'm going to turn now, if I may, to Silke Carlo, who's going to give her opening statement, her overview around AI and the threats and the challenges that it poses. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the committee for giving Big Brother Watch the opportunity to share our research and analysis. Responding directly to the question about examples of artificial intelligence involved in human rights breaches today, I'd echo the evidence given that it's incredibly hard to get information in this area. Although we know that such harms are happening, when we find examples, finding detailed information takes a lot of hard work. So the examples that I want to give are mostly actually from Big Brother Watch investigations, spanning welfare, education, policing, justice, healthcare, national security. So for example, I will talk, I think, further in this session about the use of facial recognition in policing, which is now operating at quite a large scale nationally. I think already in this year, our estimate is that, from police figures, that around 3 million people have had their faces scanned by police facial recognition technology. Only less than 1/10 of a percentage of those scans result in a positive identification and an arrest. So AI clearly can relate to a massive expansion of mass surveillance in this country. We have seen examples in the criminal justice system. An investigation that we did a few years ago into Durham Police found that they had developed their own AI tool called HART, the Harm Assessment Risk Tool, which is essentially a recidivism scoring tool. And that was used to, before a decision was made about whether to charge an individual and prosecute them, they were put through this AI system to basically give a risk assessment of reoffending. And then a decision was made whether to put that person forward for a rehabilitation programme or to prosecute them. So AI being used by British police force to decide whether to prosecute somebody or not. So I think we're getting an idea that the consequences of AI uses are really significant now. And in that case, we found that two quite significantly weighted variables in the system were postcode. So individuals' postcodes were having a significant bearing on whether they were being prosecuted or not. We have also seen, you're all familiar with I'll refer to automated decision-making examples as well as AI because they're a hair's breadth away. You're all familiar with the A-level exam grading scandal where about 40% of students were received grades lower than they were anticipating, and that related as well to their postcode and to their location. So disadvantaged students were unfairly impacted by that. An investigation that we did into the use of algorithms in welfare found that a DWP algorithm wrongly flagged 200,000 people for benefits reviews. So that was a significant proportion of the people who had been flagged were wrongly flagged, which obviously causes issues for both DWP and those individuals. I wanted to reference as well national security because I think this is one of the most opaque areas about which we know very little. We do know that AI is being used by our national security agencies. For example, there was a GCHQ paper in 2021 called Pioneering a New National Security, and really it just had very vague copy about AI and cyber ethics and no real detail about how they were using AI. But I did note that the agency said they would use AI against disinformation, including, I quote, machine-assisted fact-checking, and that AI would be used to mount online operations. I think the risks of this will not be lost on anyone. Incredibly sensitive area, especially if we have intelligence agencies involved in fact-checking information on the open internet, and where it's very hard to geofence. So it could well be that British people's social media posts, for example, could be impacted by our own agencies using AI for fact-checking. I do think there is a very significant risk that we will have a future Snowden who will suddenly reveal the use of AI in the agencies, which may be eye-watering. It may be, if it's anything like the previous revelations we've seen, could be completely out of kilter with what the average citizen would expect. And then just finally, I think one of the most chilling examples of AI being used in an opaque way in this country comes in the healthcare setting. The liver transplant benefit score. This is an example of an AI that was deployed in healthcare to determine whether an individual would be offered a liver transplant or not. So this is a life and death decision that was being made with AI. There were no humans involved in overseeing the score, and there was no appeals process, and actually people affected by this weren't fully informed about what happened. I would really recommend a fantastic long read in this about this in the Financial Times, looking at one case of a young woman called Sarah Meredith. She required a liver transplant and she wasn't being offered one. She, through her own research and her family's research, realised that this AI tool was being used. And she realised that even if different data points changed, she would not get a different outcome from the tool. She was not under any circumstances being offered a liver transplant. It was then that she realised that it was her age that was the obstructive factor, because she was a young woman, and this tool had been set up in a way that it favoured transplants for older people, even though this was going to be life-saving for her. And she had to then equip herself with knowledge and attempt to challenge that system. So I think the point is that already it's very, very hard to get these examples, but they are out there. AI is being used with very, very significant effect and a high degree of opacity. We're not talking just about future risks. The harms of AI are happening today.
Thank you, Silky. That was a very clear exposition for the committee, and if other examples come to light that you're aware of, do share them with us as well. Temitope Lazard-Anderson, would you like to now address this issue as well of what do we know about the existing risks of AI?
Yeah, so at Glitch, our focal population as a charity and who we advocate on behalf of is black women and black gender expansive people, and as a specific racialized and gendered demographic who do face historic and continuing marginalization. And so as a result, the issue areas we look at is racial and gender injustice as it pertains to technology use and power. So that's sort of going to be the framing of any of my sort of comments today. I think like harms are breaches of rights, but again, just to give some context, we think about these as individual breaches of human rights, as collective breaches of human rights, and then there are societal breaches. And individual breaches are when the interests of a person are wrongfully thwarted or contravened, and collective is when a collective or demographic or a specific group of people are disproportionately impacted. And then societal breaches, as we frame them, are when there have been contravention in societal interests which can impact democracy, which the use of AI, particularly in the public sector, threaten. Right now, I want to focus more on an individual case, which is very pervasive and is predominantly around individual and private sector use of AI. So there are numerous AI tools around generative AI, which allow for the proliferation of non-consensual intimate image-based abuse, or known as deepfake intimate image-based abuse, or so-called revenge porn. These AI tools and apps allow someone to use a tool to denudify a photo of someone or create sexually explicit imagery of them, and this can then be shared online without consent, or as it also relates to intimate partner violence, can be used to threaten or coerce a victim or survivor. You may have known that there are several high-profile cases of this. The most recent, I think, in last January was when sexually explicit AI-generated deepfake images of the musician Taylor Swift were created and shared online. And research from My Image, My Choice, which is an advocacy group, found in 2024 that in the previous year, 98% of all deepfakes found online were sexually explicit, and 99% depict women. And that was a 17,000 increase in new deepfake images that had been posted online from 2019 to 2023. And concerningly for us, deepfake intimate image-based abuse doesn't only exploit gender vulnerabilities in terms of who's disproportionately impacted, but also racial stereotypes, which does lead to a unique and severe form of victimization for Black and other racialized women. And this means that deepfakes also result in compounding of the existing structural and systemic racism and sexism that does impact victims' personal and professional lives. And so Glitch and others, professors and legal scholars, do argue that deepfake's intimate image abuse does fundamentally constitute a violation of human rights for victim survivors, as per the Human Rights Act. The impacts of these violations can be far-reaching and long-lasting. In particular, as found by Professors Claire McGlynn and Erica Rackley, there are individual harms of physical and mental illness together with the loss of dignity, privacy, and sexual autonomy, which do combine to constitute a form of cultural harm, really, that does impact directly on individuals, as well as society as a whole in terms of, misogyny and gender-based violence. And as described by the victim's minister, Alex Davies-Jones, intimate image abuse is a deeply degrading and misogynistic form of abuse. So when victim survivors describe their experiences of this harm, they say it is a shattering social rupture or a violation, and it can devastate all aspects of their lives. So we say that this degrading abuse does constitute a violation of Article 3 of the Human Rights Act, which does secure the right not to be subjected to torture or to inhumane or degrading treatment or punishment. But intimate image abuse also constitutes a violation of Article 8 of the Human Rights Act, which is around the right to privacy. There is existing case law. Volodina v. Russia in 2021 does show that the European Court of Human Rights accepted that cyber violence, including image-based sexual abuse, such as non-consensual intimate image-based abuse, does then constitute a violation of Article 8. And I think it's important to say that while there is existing legislation in the Online Safety Act that now criminalizes the sharing of this abuse, this specific type of AI-facilitated abuse does not have any form of redress or remedy. And so earlier this year, the Women and Equality Select Committee put forward a clear recommendation in its fourth report of the session that to tackle this abuse, we need to amend the eligibility criteria of the Criminal Justice Compensation Scheme to bring claims from victims of sexual offences perpetrated online within its scope, which the government did reject. The government also rejected the recommendation to introduce a swift, inexpensive statutory civil process, as has been established in other regions, such as British Columbia in Canada. On the basis of this function being available through the Online Safety Act. But as the previous panel mentioned, sort of individual redress through these legislative options is very costly, very difficult to access, and oftentimes does not provide an individual route.
Thank you very much, Tamitope. I know that my colleague, Sir Desmond Swain, will come...
No, I think you've answered my question comprehensively already.
About bias and discrimination. So, well, thank you for that. But so we'll hear from Mr. Ruiz next, and then after that we'll turn to a question on enhanced surveillance and facial recognition.
Thank you very much. Thanks to the committee. Representing here Amnesty International UK, we are the UK section of our global movement. I think the examples that we have found in the UK, we want to make clear that are only a small part of the evidence that the whole of Amnesty International has collected. There is a lot of work, for example, in the Netherlands, in many other countries where we have identified digital algorithmic artificial intelligence harms. And I think I would like to, obviously contribute. I think many of the findings that we have are quite similar or potentially overlap, so I'm not going to repeat what my colleagues in the panel have said. But just to take like one step, is something that we are finding is that it, of course, is very hard to identify what is the artificial intelligence harm. When we have been looking at harms around algorithms and technology, what we are finding, one of the problems is the inevitability and exceptionalism in the way that this technology is framed, and that we think that that is driving a sense that we have to somehow go over human rights, that there is this force that is unstoppable, so we have to move aside. So that in itself, we think that is particularly a problem. Now, we are not saying that this is just normal technology, although to a point it is a question of scale, there is a question of higher degrees of autonomy and control, but there are obviously also quite new things that extend and maybe transform. For example, there are questions around the impact of geoguessing, which is where there is now the possibility of showing a picture to an LLM and asking where is this picture taken. In some cases you can find out. So, for example, anonymizing evidence of like reporting on human rights could lead to the identification of the person that is reporting. Obviously, it could also lead to the identification of where the abuse took place. No? So it works both ways. But we see some things that are potentially fundamentally new. But in the two areas that we have work in the UK around predictive policing and automation of social security, which we have submitted, and I'm not going to go in detail through all of the report to reproduce what we put in writing, but I think what we find is that some of the newness of AI, we are finding that it starts to reflect there, but could potentially amplify the problems we have seen. But we would like to be able to work more to know how these things are working, and we are not able to do it because of the lack of information. So, for example, something that is potentially new is the statistical nature of AI and how it doesn't create certainty, and we see that there is an acceptance of risk. So we are saying, well, this system, some people are going to be wrongly identified in facial recognition, and we know that this is going to happen. The question is like, we are accepting this, and we try to maybe hide it or go one way or another, but there is a fundamental question on accepting a certain level of risk, while at the same time trying to present these systems as quite like determinative, no? So this person is a criminal. We have identified, what are you doing? Let's take you to a police station and interrogate you, rather than say, well, we have a degree of confidence. And actually, as you tweak the systems to provide more confidence, you get more false positives, negatives. You've been looking at all of that. So I think that this statistical way of thinking is something that we haven't really caught up with. And that is something that is not really reflecting the way that the policy is made. So we are saying all the eligibility criteria, risk profiling that we are seeing is giving very certain effects on people where they get their benefits cut or they are stopped by the police. But it's not so, we think, no, it's that we know that this is happening. So that's problem number one. The other problem that we are finding, of course, is the human interface that was referred in the previous panel, and the anthropomorphism of these technologies creating added problems. Like we are finding that in the replacement of human interaction in the benefits system, where it's really creating situations where complex cases and vulnerable people are unable to deal with these chatbots or avatars. And I think that there is something there around the intrinsic limitations of these systems to be able to deal with certain complexity or processes that are not being fundamentally acknowledged when we are setting out these chatbots to deal with welfare. So, and finally, the role of data, and I think that that is something that the technologies are not neutral. The data that comes in, so I think what we are saying is that in predictive policing, we are reproducing the bias of racist policing into automation, and we are building them into the system. So I think that this is something that we need to really deal with, and we find that it's very, very hard, where the chicken egg situation is that unless we change the practice and we generate new data, we are not going to have an automated system that is not racist, because the reality is that you are feeding it racist data. And those things are very, very hard to to solve through many of the proposals that we see elsewhere as like the potential solutions. And I think that particularly when it comes to analyzing people as data, one concern overall that we have is the concept of social scoring, which is to understand someone on the basis of their profile rather than evidence. And this is something that is being challenged in other places like the European Union, and we think that is at risk of happening in the UK. So overall, the situation that we have is that we are worried that the UK may literally become a dumping ground for technologies that are not allowed in jurisdictions nearby, because in other places they are putting red lines, so we think that we need to really start taking action.
That's very helpful, Mr. Roos. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you to all four of the panellists for raising the curtain for us. One thing that you just mentioned around AI being used for enhanced facial recognition is something that the committee is very concerned about. My colleague, Lord Delakia, I think, has a question to Silke Carlo about this. The floor is yours.
The recent evidence that one seemed to gather on this particular matter is the fact that the sample of some of the communities is so small in this country, minority communities, that the type of evidence that you can obtain are not going to be very relevant. What is being done about that particular matter?
So do you mean about the bias in the facial recognition algorithm
yes.
itself? Yes. It's something that we've been very concerned about. That then, I think, repeatedly raising those concerns resulted in the Metropolitan Police undertaking a report with the National Physical Laboratory in which they claim that the discrimination against people of colour is now not statistically significant when they use the algorithm at a certain threshold. I think the Metropolitan Police would probably give their account of that. Our view on it is that it's not satisfactory to say if we tweak the settings, the discrimination will not reach a statistically significant level. It also relates to scale. Like, our concern is that that testing was in a very small trial operated by the Metropolitan Police. If you use this nationwide and constantly, then even a small error margin becomes tens of thousands of people quite quickly. And if that is happening in a discriminatory way, then obviously there are extra, further human rights and legal concerns about that. So it is a very well-known and very well-documented problem with facial recognition algorithms. For sure, they are getting more accurate, and I'm afraid to say that the lack of regulatory action in this area means that some people have paid the price for almost 10 years now that the police have been using this, because it was absolutely awful when they first started using it. And I was witnessing, for example, because I've monitored on the ground police using live facial recognition for many years, I've witnessed women being flagged as wanted men and people of different ethnicities. It was really, really poor. So, and there have been lots of misidentifications over the years. So, for example, in the early use at Notting Hill Carnival, there was 1 year where there were 100 or 101 flags, and like 99 of those were misidentifications.
Thank you. It actually is an important point about where we are in terms of regulation itself and law. And perhaps I can bring Tamitope in here as well, because I'm interested about what protections there are against discrimination and bias, whether it's at the Notting Hill Carnival or anywhere else for that matter, and how those kind of biases can be addressed effectively. So do existing laws, do they work at the moment? And if not, how do we enhance them? So perhaps, Silke, could you just continue for a moment on that, and we'll go to Tamitope and see if there's anybody else wants to chip in.
The law as it stands hasn't meaningfully restricted the use of facial recognition technology in this country. As a result, NGOs operating on small budgets like Big Brother Watch are afraid have become the regulators of last resort. So Big Brother Watch is now backing a judicial review of the Metropolitan Police's use of live facial recognition technology. That is being brought by an anti-knife crime campaigner called Sean Thompson, who I witnessed being misidentified at London Bridge. And he was held by police for about half an hour, treated quite badly, very nearly arrested. And so he and I are now undertaking a joint judicial review.
Sorry, if it's a live.
Yes, I'm just being advised we can't actually discuss live criminal cases, and I'm slightly anxious that we shouldn't stray into that territory. So.
That's okay. It's not a criminal case; it's a judicial review. But
well,
any litigation whatsoever.
Any live case.
Any live case, whether it's a judicial review or a case before the courts, we're just governed by that, but we can't actually discuss those details in open committee in this way. So,
well, understood. I mean, I think also I refer to Liberty supporting the challenge by Ed Bridges. So we can, there's a pattern has emerged where NGOs have to try to uphold convention rights in the area of AI, in particular around facial recognition, by taking up very lengthy and costly judicial reviews. And as was mentioned by the witnesses you heard from before, the Bridges challenge was 5 years ago. And only now the government is talking about consulting on a legal framework for facial recognition. So I think the government's been a bit asleep at the wheel, to be honest, and we're a bit behind the times. There is no meaningful restriction in law on the use of facial recognition. I'm just talking about live facial recognition. Another thing which is desperately under-discussed is the fact that the passport database and the immigration database have been turned into mass facial recognition databases in a way that I don't think anyone would expect would be permitted given our Article 8 privacy rights. And there are other use of facial recognition as well. So we're seeing that NGOs are really having to undertake litigation in order to make human rights actually.
I was very struck by your phrase
matter.
that you've become the regulators of last resort. I mean, that is placing an enormous burden on non-governmental organisations. Tamitope, do you want to come in on this point, and then we'll perhaps bring in the other two members of the panel?
I think I'll just add, if you look at it from a perspective of an individual, right? So in I think Manchester recently, they started to the Manchester Police Force there had facial recognition deployed with no prior information, no consent. There's no real way an individual can opt out if you're walking down the street, right? And there's a police van. In fact, we have seen, I'm sure my colleagues here will know, where there have been cases where people have said, hey, I want to opt out, and then the police at that van then have a questioning for you, and they suggest that you can't opt out. So I think there is just sort of an individual, again, inability to not have your face scanned in this way. Around the question of legislation, and I think as our earlier panel mentioned, is an accidental legislation around AI use, but in terms of specific issues around discrimination and bias, there's immense fragmentation and insufficiency. So there are existing rights-based protections, which comes across the Equality Act, the Data Protection Act, GDPR, the Human Rights Act, and the Public Sector Equality Duty, but these were not designed to govern AI, and that is on the opacity, the scale, or the autonomy issues, and whether that's upstream or downstream. And so they also rely on individuals or civil society or under-resourced and ill-equipped in terms of skill regulators to then challenge any of these harms sort of ex post. I'm not even talking about ex ante or preventative measures. So I think that's fairly succinct from me in terms of where we are today.
That's very helpful, thank you. So the laws that we have are laws by accident, and they're fragmented, and there are huge gaps. Now, two of my colleagues have been so provoked by what you've said that they want to ask a supplementary before I come back to the other two panellists. So first of all, Mr. Afzal Khan, and then Lord Sewell.
I just want to ask the question on the facial recognition technology being used. Could it be argued that the fact that technology is progressing, improving, and therefore some of the errors that you may be getting now would be ironed out with improvements? And the supplementary question I want to ask on this one is, myself, I have a passport which I can use, and this recognizes it. What I find interesting is when I've gone to many other places, there's been no problem. When I'm coming back to Britain, it never recognizes me, so I have to go through the manual system. Mm-hmm. So is that an error, or is it been loaded in a way to pick certain types of individuals?
Let's take Lord Sewell as well, because that's a really interesting question.
I was just thinking about almost being positive about AI, because none of you really kind of given us something that could help us. I mean, I'm just thinking of, in terms of knife crime and the profiling of it, we do know, and particularly in London, a proportional demographic that does get involved in knife crime. And the police already use profiling in order to then try and find perpetrators. So they're already, the human side of it is already involved in some kind of, human intelligence rather than artificial intelligence. And so, I mean, it comes back to your point. Surely, wouldn't it be better if we had the technology that had facial recognition that was sharp enough to get even deeper and sharper around recognizing who they are? So in other words, why not argue for more AI? More why argue against it? Because it would be you then would be more likely to find the perpetrator accurately rather than somebody who is at the behest of just human instinct. I mean, that's where we're going with that. I want to sort of almost push you to the other side to say, wouldn't it, on a human rights level, be better to argue for using the tool, particularly around racial bias?
Okay, so you've got some excellent questions there, and I think we'll start, because I want to make sure all our panelists get in. So, Ms. Perlot de Corbillon, why don't you start, and then we'll go to Mr. Ruiz, and then to the other two.
Great. No, thank you very much for giving us a chance to weigh on this discussion. I mean, coming back to your question, we're veering towards a tool that would be relying on the accuracy also, and that the tool would work well, which currently is, given the example that Silky shared and other examples that were given the panel, that we know that it's not working properly. And in the scale that is currently being deployed, it risks becoming, if not already, a tool of mass surveillance. And there are 2 points that for us are particularly concerning with the use of facial recognition. One is the scale of the surveillance that is possible, not only to identify but to authenticate individuals on a mass scale, which means that it's no longer directed around and targeted to specific individuals, but groups of people, for example, and spaces, for example, at protests. The second one is with regard to the scope of facial recognition technology. And Silky mentioned the live use of FRT, but there's also retrospective FRT, which means non-live or static. And so it's no longer just being seen on a CCTV camera, but it's the ability really to identify verify a person or persons' identity in real time, which renders this technology even more invasive than the current deployment we've seen, for example, with CCTV cameras. The third point I wanted to make before handing over is, in terms of the harms that are experienced by people with the deployment of such technologies, because there's a clear distinction between being monitored anonymously versus being identified, and the protection that comes with that anonymity are really important in our democratic society, and it can have a chilling effect on a person's behavior, choosing to attend a protest or choosing to commute in a certain path where there might be more facial recognition, and so that aspect of protection that comes with anonymity is really important, and it's really linked to our democratic values.
Thank you very much indeed. Mr. Ruiz.
Yes, following on that, I think that the question of data to improve the quality of systems was actually debated quite a lot in the European Union at the time of the passing of the AI Act, and it is, of course, we are dealing with discrimination, solving the discrimination problem by adding more data. That can be a good thing in some contexts. I think for Amnesty International as a whole, the formal position is that facial recognition as a tool of mass surveillance is fundamentally incompatible with human rights, and it just cannot happen. So I think that is like the bottom line. Then we can question whether if it's not mass surveillance, When is it not, then can we look at discrimination? Of course, you can compound human rights problems, so you can have a tool for mass surveillance that is also discriminatory against certain people. In that context, what we are finding is that the one problematic issue is the indirect discrimination. So I think that's something that AI is very good is at making connections and inferences on things that are not immediately obvious. So the problem we find is that, well, you are not targeted because you are X, you are targeted because the machine has found something, like the example of the lady with the age, you was unable to find what is it, why am I being discriminated? It could be something like your age as a proxy, but it could be something else as a proxy for your age. So I think that is something that we are finding particularly problematic. But that is, again, setting out that some technologies and certain intentions of not even just the technology itself, seem to be fundamentally incompatible with human rights. And then in terms of other problems we find is, of course, current protections around data protection, access, transparency, all of that seems not to work at all. It's very impossible, pretty much impossible, to find out really in detail how your data is being processed. So we think that definitely we need new safeguards to be able to build on the basics that we have.
Thank you very much. So it's fundamentally incompatible with human rights, is what you just said to us.
Facial recognition is fundamentally incompatible. When it becomes mass surveillance, then we can start working back from that to see if there are some circumstances, but the principle and the common position, and I would be happy to share with you the documents from the international.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Khan will want an answer to his question about passports, but also I'd like to ask, if I may, Temitope, if bias in AI systems can ever be addressed effectively, and if they can, what should we be doing to try and ameliorate the worst effects of bias?
Yeah, this is a tricky one, and I'm not a technologist, but there's this idea that you can de-bias a data set, right? So there's this idea that if you look at the example of facial recognition technology, which is sometimes used on mass databases, I think it was the GANGS database, the GANGS matrix is one database, for example, which has an overrepresentation of people of color or of black men, for example. And so there's this argument that if you have a database that has, a proportionate amount of images of all different people, then you use that data to train the algorithm, then you have an algorithm that is de-biased. But that doesn't necessarily eradicate the issue, because if you still have a small percentage of people who are misidentified or have error rates, that can still be a large number of people overall. And so I think, similarly to Amnesty International's position, at Glitch, we would say that sort of any mass surveillance tool, which can be facial recognition or anything like a digital ID, for example, would be fundamentally incompatible with human rights. And the issue with discrimination and bias is also around existing structural and systemic issues. So Silke mentioned the examples of postcodes, which are proxies for different kinds of demographics of people. And so when you have a postcode that is a lower socioeconomic area, for example, and that tends to have more engagement with policing, then you already have a notion that there is an issue with this area. So then when you apply that sort of database into an automated tool, it is going to likely suggest that these people from this area need to be let's say surveilled, or in predictive policing sense, or in the recidivism case, then it will be someone who often has a number of engagements with the criminal justice system, for example. So it isn't just a matter of having a de-biased data set. That's just simply not good enough. Because the fundamental issue with AI is that it can result in increased discriminatory outcomes, and so that's where it is really important to ensure that there are guardrails or red lines, or at least what we would say, where AI, particularly for high risk, although the risk-based approach of the EU Act was rightly criticized, but there needs to be some sort of red lines as to where AI is not involved in, and particularly the difference between sort of individual issues or the private sector's use of AI in terms of generative AI, right? Individuals have some sort of choice on which tools they may wish to use or engage. When it comes to the public sector, there is no choice there. You don't get a decision decision with how you get to engage with healthcare, with the criminal justice system, with the education system, where currently today in the UK there are automated decision-making tools being used. And so, because of the public sector...
Would there be, sorry to interrupt, would there be therefore different regulations for the public and private sectors?
I think, yes, you would need, because I think also, because as the previous colleague mentioned, it depends on the different sector and the issue area and how that regulation would apply. But there cannot sort of be one flattened approach to AI regulation across the board.
Ricardo.
Thank you. I appreciate those follow-up questions, and also don't want to sound at all as though I'm arguing like for or against AI in general. And I think if we can use technology to improve policing and criminal justice system, fantastic. Obviously, as a group that's interested in protecting and promoting human rights, we do focus on the risks because they are so prevalent at the moment. It's a fairly consensus position that most human rights groups view the police's use of live facial recognition as in breach of individuals' rights. You've heard that from Amnesty, their position on that. The Equality and Human Rights Commission and 130 human rights groups have called for a stop to live facial recognition being used in the UK based on the information that we have seen. I don't think at all, actually, that the central issue with technology like live facial recognition is accuracy. And in many cases with AI, I don't really think the key issue is with accuracy whatsoever. It has been an issue, and it does mean that in the early years of deployment, lots and lots of people have suffered as a result real human rights harms and discrimination. But you're absolutely right that the Metropolitan Police's algorithm has gotten a lot better. So they're making far fewer misidentifications than they used to. That's absolutely true. But there are a host of other issues. So number one is the lack of regulation. This is happening, and even the police are saying that they are, they're making up their own policies. There are not clear guidelines on how to use this, and they're essentially having to make it up as they go along. There is very little accountability and transparency with facial recognition, but other types of AI as well. If you are flagged by many of these systems, you may not know why. And I think that contradicts very basic British values about transparency and fairness and democratic values, really. It also means that there's a chilling effect. Because if you feel that surveillance systems or other AI systems used by government departments could be watching you, judging you, flagging you, making decisions about you, and you don't know why, and you can't challenge it, I do think that cuts through our very long-standing values about fairness and what we expect from public authorities. The other thing about this, the risk inherent with something like live facial recognition and other similar AI systems is the scale and the speed at which they work. You'll hear from other people that that's a great benefit of AI, a great benefit of facial recognition, the scale and the speed at which it works. But actually it means that it lends itself to mass surveillance. And that means it lends itself to changing the fabric of the country that we live in. You can't imagine a situation in which, say, at Westminster Station, a police officer was taking a fingerprint from every single person who came through that station just to check, and we just throw it away afterwards, don't worry. The fact that the data can be processed at scale and very quickly doesn't make it any less intrusive. It's making it more intrusive because it's happening at an enormous scale. Earlier, the witnesses were asking, have we seen this film before? I think we have. When you think about dystopian mass surveillance that can be used in that way, given that we are on the brink of a national mandatory ID system, which is a facial biometric system, I think we have to think about those risks very, very carefully. Things like live facial recognition and AI mass surveillance being used in this way can spiral out of control and be used in many other ways by public authorities, really in the blink of the eyes.
Thank you very much. Now, I know that Mr. Sobel wants to ask about mitigation, so that's a very good point to come in on.
Thank you. I was just down the corridor yesterday with the Secretary of State for DCMS and DCIT discussing AI in the creative industry sector, and the bit that we focused on was the ingestion of data by creators, and then, although less so, the ability of individual users to opt in or opt out of AI material, say on a streaming platform. So, but I'm a graduate in information systems, so the sort of whole life cycle, the whole sort of systems life cycle in AI or any information product is much bigger than just data in, data out. There's the design stage, there's the development stage, there's there's the modelling, then there is those data stages. Now, from your experience, do you think that the threats to data security and privacy occur all the way through that life cycle, or are there particular stages that we should be looking at? Because if we're going to legislate and regulate this, we have to know at which end of the telescope we are looking, or are we looking right through a telescope from the beginning till the point of which it sees? That was a terrible analogy, but I think you get what I mean. And what measures could we undertake in terms of regulating on AI to prevent or mitigate threats from AI in terms of the development life cycle?
Yes. Great, thank you. So yeah, I'll be responding to your point on the data life cycle. As you've seen already from the examples that were given by the first panel and then in the second panel as well, there's a wide range of AI systems and they all function different ways in different contexts. But one common denominator of any AI system is the data. And the way we see it at PI is that AI systems are exploiting that data. So the short answer to your question is that at every stage of the life cycle, as Dr. King was mentioning earlier, there needs to be safeguards because there's potential for threats to privacy and data security because it's always about the data. But maybe giving you a longer answer that you might appreciate today, around 3 moments in the data lifecycle that are key here. The first one is around the data collection and data gathering. So the input data, as you were mentioning, how much of it, where does it come from what kind of data and about who. And this has been a key concern that has been raised, for example, in the development of large language models built by companies like OpenAI, by Meta, XAI, or Mistral as well. What is the data that's being processed by these companies and where is it coming from? Similarly, in the earlier example I gave around Clear AI and the use of photos, they were scraping that from social media and from the internet. So again, questioning where that data comes from. And this is why it's really essential to scrutinize the sources of the data and how it was obtained in the first place. Is it being repurposed for a purpose for which it was never intended? Is that purpose, that new purpose, proportionate, necessary, and lawful? And the failure to get this right at the onset really triggers privacy and data security concerns even before an AI system has even been deployed. The second point or stage in the data lifecycle that I wanted to elaborate on is these processing activities to which the data that's been collected will be subject to. And that really depends on what is the design of the AI system. It can be a set of parameters or it might not. So that really depends on that design level. But at this stage, what we're particularly concerned about is how the data that was collected will be exploited and analyzed with a particular purpose in mind. And here to give a few examples that we've seen here in the UK, take the example of Palantir's role in the NHS. What processing activities was the data that was given to Palantir subject to? Similarly, we've been working very closely with union and workers for many years now, and we've seen how workers in the gig economy's data is being used by employers to use algorithms and use the data about them to rate them, to also decide how much they should be getting paid, and whether they should even be given a job in a particular context. So those decisions are being made at that level. We've talked a lot about transparency around AI system, and at that particular stage of the life cycle, what's really concerning, and you might have heard of this concept of a black box of an AI system, but that even the designers or the users of an AI system might not be able to explain What is it? What are those processing activities? And that's real challenge to be able to know what's actually being done to that data and to make sure it's not being used to undermine the integrity of the data, but also to undermine people's rights. The last point around the data lifecycle is particularly when it comes to its use, its application. And I gave a few examples earlier around the Home Office appearing to be used algorithmic tools for immigration purposes, including deciding whether a person can remain in the UK, whether they face deportation, whether they'll be subject to GPS tagging or have their freedoms restricted through detention. And then we heard similar examples from the DWP about deciding who deserves to have access to benefit and welfare support. And so these are really impacting people's dignity and autonomy. And so when we're looking at this at that level of the data lifecycle, we need to be asking whether the AI system is actually being used to solve a problem that was identified. And whether in solving that problem, is it creating more harms and risks actually for people and undermining them? And all the threats that I've just mentioned, it's possible to mitigate them. But it requires at every stage of that, where decisions are being made, that the starting point should be, what is the data, is it being protected, and how is it impacted people, and what are mitigation measures that can be implemented along the way. I'll stop here, but I'd be happy to elaborate.
It's very helpful, actually. I mean, to give us those kind of guardrails is very helpful indeed. And if people want to add to that subsequently, then of course, please feel free to write to us. Now, I know that Mr. Rose wants to come in, but we've got a question to you now, so maybe you can add it to your answer. And we're going to go back to Mr. Khan. I don't know whether you're able to tell him what remedy he will get because of what happened to his passport, but remedies, what can we do about things going wrong? How can we put any of these injustices that you've been describing right? I think that's your point, isn't it, Mr. Khan?
That's right. Thank you, Chair. So how easy is it for people affected by AI to seek redress? And does the law offer appropriate remedies for affected individuals? And the supplementary with that is there a case for a dedicated regulatory body or ombudsman to address AI harms?
Mr. Rose, this one is for you, and in a moment we're going to come to Tom Gordon, Mr. Gordon, Member of Parliament, who's going to ask you the trickiest question of them all about your recommendations. So that will be a chance for you to perhaps summarise as well any points you want to make to us about practical things we can do. So please, over to you, Mr. Rose.
So in terms of I will combine, as you said, the two responses. So before we get to the remedies, I think some of the problems that we need to remedy include a lack of full understanding of the problem, as we said before. So picking up on some of the questions and some of the arguments that were made, I mean, I think, for example, if we are deploying systems in the public sector, something that we think that would be useful as a remedy would be to have a discussion as to where the resources are coming from. Is this substituting some other functions that are already being provided? So to also look at what is the cost or even the opportunity cost of going down this path. There is also the real, and we think that here for us one fundamental pre-remedy would be participation. So we think that participatory processes in designing who is going to benefit, is the organization that is going to benefit, or are the people receiving the benefits going to benefit. And I think in Taiwan, we are seeing right now some good examples. We were asking for international examples before. So in Taiwan now there's a good participatory process for developing the legislation, but also some of the processes. So now in terms of remedies, what we have found actually that the situation is not good at all, starting from transparency, as we said before, the lack of information from a data protection point of view. It's very hard to find out how decisions are made and even what data was used to make them. So we think that, and then from the point of view of equalities, as we said, there are this idea, well, is this fair? What was the result? May have been fair in one sense, but from the point of view of the individual, wasn't. So we think that and to unpack the levels of this potential discrimination there when it comes to indirect characteristics is proving very hard. So we think that we do need additional safeguards. We do need to create specific rights to obtain more information about decisions. And I think that here is not just a matter of the human in the loop, as we've seen, but the idea that meaningful decisions we need to take apart the decision process and not just put potentially the human as just like a rubber stamp. So I think that is that's something that we need to be very, very careful with. And then in terms of a particular regulator, so I think this is something that I actually was maybe in this room a few years ago in the inquiry, looking at a similar question. Should we have one regulator? So, I think it was with some people from the Oxford, Cambridge University, and at the time, I think that the consensus from many people in civil society was that it was better to get the regulators to do their job properly, as they do now. Now, I am not 100% sure. We haven't got to that point of a position. What I would say about regulators is that we have to be careful with putting all our eggs on regulators. If you look at the role of Ofcom in the Online Safety Act, this approach that I followed, they had to employ a huge amount of people, and they've been given the role of making decisions that probably should be made by someone else, but they are forced into this juggling of, is this a free expression problem? Is it not? Trying to create rules. I think that in the question of AI, and is this a fair decision, I think that it may be unfair to expect the regulators to basically take on some of those.
But I think Mr. Khan's question was specifically about should there be a dedicated, specific regulator who does nothing else other than this.
Yeah, so that's the question. So if you look at how Ofcom has to deal with these problems, I mean, what kind of regulator can deal with everything that we've talked from facial recognition to benefits? So I think that we are not sure, but if it was to be a regulator, it would require huge resources. Also, if we look, I think that regulators, I don't think we can talk about regulation without looking at the state of waters and rivers. I'm a keen, water sports person. I dread to paddleboard in rivers because, it's fairly dangerous. So I think when I look at water regulation, it's an absolute failure. So I think that we also have to be careful of the expectations that we put. So whether it's one regulator or whether it's many regulators, I think we need to be very careful looking at resources, not giving the regulator more responsibility and actually being very clear guidelines, so we are not passing on the ball now to our regulator. And then, obviously making sure that there are other elements for accountability on the regulators. Yeah.
That's very helpful, thank you. So the last question is going to go to Tom Gordon.
Thank you, Chair. Obviously, at the end of the inquiry that we're doing, we'll be putting together a report to government, and obviously there'll be recommendations in that. What I'd be really interested in, obviously, we've heard sort of a breadth of different issues and potential solutions, but what would be your top one or two things, recommendations to government in terms of tackling this issue? Should we sort of start here and work across?
So, I think for us, as well, what we said before, one, definitely to create new specific protections. Then I think that we need clear red lines. There are some things, as we said before, maybe facial recognition, maybe social scoring. There are certain things that we think these things shouldn't happen. This is not to say that there shouldn't be research on technologies, I think, but the application of those technologies, there should be some very clear red lines on things that should not happen. Now, there are some other areas that are a bit more on the detail of how you go about it. Something that I think is particularly problematic is the accountability of technical systems, is that we encounter issues around commercial confidentiality. And this, I think, is something that should be tackled. Unfortunately, as we were saying before, I do work on digital trade, and we are signing up trade agreements that specifically ban access to source code in the name of protecting the intellectual property of companies. So I think that removing at least any barriers to the access to technology to make the black box a little less opaque, or I think those things would be useful. And then there would be obviously many more details that we could process. But I think that definitely those, and I think that it was going back to the question of the private, I think that's something that we are seeing. Obviously the convention, the Framework Convention of the Council of Europe will more or less, if it goes ahead, if it doesn't get sabotaged along the way by greater powers, it will force the UK to take some form of action. I think that it would be good to take the opportunity to expand rather than do a de minimis, particularly when it comes to trying to add something on the role of private companies that may be providing systems, and as we said before, in supply chains where it's very hard to decide, well, is this providing a service or is the company buying a product that is providing the service? So trying to tackle the commercial confidentiality, that would be quite important.
Temitope Anderson, the floor is yours. Your two suggestions.
I just want to frame it in that not all sort of AI tools, when implemented, carry equal risk, right? The risk is relational. So biometric and surveillance tech present severe direct threats. So for Glitch, for us, the main thing is really just to plus one what you were saying, that there needs to be sort of red lines and hard lines as to where we should not be seeing AI use. Particularly for us, it would be in the public sector, as it is very difficult to see under what conditions of transparency. For us, we would suggest that any sort of new legislation, we would also agree that there needs to be a new regulatory and legislative framework that particularly looks at AI, that these are rights compliant, and then particularly that there needs to be options to challenge a decision, and that is not only about the transparency, but also in terms of redress. And I think I'll leave there.
Thank you. Over to you now, Silky Carlo.
Yeah, thank you. I think it would be encouraging to see sufficient weight put on AI risks within government, so that if they are going to continue with this very optimistic and very commercial focused outlook, it has to be paired with regulations. Otherwise we will continue to see litigation, high profile mistakes being made, etc., etc. It is a concern that so far in this Parliament we've seen the Data Use and Access Bill, which has basically decimated individuals' rights and protections against automated decision making. So that's just suddenly been liberalised. So whereas we currently had an assumed prohibition on automated decisions being made about people where the effects would be significant, and already you've heard about the harm, so that wasn't working very well, the government has now basically liberalised automated decision making for all purposes. It's really, really serious, and it hasn't been given enough attention. I'm afraid we're going to see many, many more harms as a result of that. Also, I just want to say, I don't actually think that was a Labour policy. It wasn't really a Conservative policy. It was a DSIT policy. It came from civil servants, and everyone's basically been too asleep at the wheel to do anything about it. I think at this stage we need something like an EU-style AI Act, or a digital Bill of Rights, a specific piece of legislation that takes a risk-based approach to artificial intelligence and can deal with many of the different areas that this committee has heard about, that can put in red lines, as we've seen has happened in Europe, and also give people the confidence to use AI in the places where it is going to benefit people. But at this stage, we certainly do need overarching legislation to deal with some of the most serious risks. My understanding is that there is AI legislation coming, but again, it's growth focused and it's not addressing the risks.
That's really helpful, and thank you for pointing us to some of the guardrails and some of the restrictions that might be introduced and models that we can have a look at from elsewhere too. I think that is really helpful. Last word to you, if we may, Alex Polo de Corbillon. You've given us great evidence throughout the whole of the hearing. Give us those two things that you would want us to take away.
Great. No, thank you. At the risk of repeating some of my colleagues, I'll try and be brief, but the first one is really around accountability. I mean, we've heard it today, the current regulatory framework is fragmented, it's not working well, and so what we need to be really seeing today is the UK government taking steps to ensure that there's a strong legally binding instrument in place, because what we've seen so far with ethical guidelines are not sufficient, white papers as well are not putting a lot of pressure or putting incentives, and self-regulation by companies is also not effective. But there's also an important element around that accountability piece, is that it needs to be founded on the UK's existing national and international human rights obligation, rather than a focus on innovation and growth, as Silky just mentioned. Importantly as well, because this has come up a lot in today's hearing, is that it needs to apply to both the private sector as well as the public sector, and that it should also apply both to personal data and non-personal data. It's not an issue we touched up on a lot today, but a lot of the data that's going also into AI system is not personal data, but it can reveal personal data, and I think that's an important element to bring in here. The second one is around transparency. We've talked about this a lot today, but the UK public cannot be kept in the dark when it comes to their data and how it's being processed through AI systems as they go about their everyday lives. And the UK government and its partners and the private sector need to be forthcoming about how they're designing but also testing some of these AI systems. We've tried many ways to get information through freedom of information request, and we're not getting that information. And so unless we know what's currently going wrong, we won't be able to remedy it. And maybe the last point, if I may take the liberty to add a third little cheeky one on the end, is that we're really concerned about the dependency that we're creating on big tech companies. And so unless that comes in very quickly, we might be setting up ourselves for a dependency that is irreversible and will be dependent on these big tech companies to make life-changing decisions about people and about their rights.
Well, I think anyone who's watched our proceedings today will know that these are awesome issues that you've been touching on. Phenomenally important. We're extremely grateful to all four of you for your generosity and your expertise and for sharing it with us. As I mentioned earlier on, if there are points you want to follow up on, then please do feel free to be in touch with our committee specialist and let us know what those are, and we will certainly consider them when we come to our recommendations. At the end of the last panel's remarks, I quoted Stephen Hawking and Geoffrey Hinton, and given what Silke Carlo was saying earlier on about dystopia and some of the worries that people have around these issues, I just remind those who are watching our proceedings today of the seriousness of what is at stake in terms of their human rights, with this remark from Yuval Noah Harari, who said, "Throughout history, humans have been tempted to pursue powers they can't handle, and with AI, we're summoning a power you can't control." And I think that the dangers are self-evident. What we do about that is a matter that this committee is now going to give a lot of attention to. And I hope that when we do produce our report, it's something that we can be proud of and that you will feel was worth your time in giving us your evidence today. So thank you very much for being here. With those words, I'd now like to close our proceedings. Order.